For this episode of the show, I am delighted to be joined by Matt Chapman. He is a professional rock climbing coach and fitness instructor. We had a great time talking about the history of climbing, the competitive climbing scene, and his 25 years in the sport. We touch on his coaching methodology and the dedicated work he does with his daughter, Indiana, a professional climber. I had a lot of fun chatting with Matt, and I think you're going to really enjoy our conversation. So without further ado, on with the show. All right. I am incredibly pleased to have as my guest today the head coach at Boulder Parc, professional climbing coach and fitness instructor, Matt Chapman. Matt, thank you for joining us today. How are you doing?
I'm great, man. Thanks, Phil, for having me on the show.
It's my pleasure. So we're going to get into we're going to talk about a lot about rock climbing. But before we get into that, we had to schedule this morning. You were coaching your daughter. Is that correct? You had a very specific fitness regimen?
Yeah, my daughter's Indiana Chapman. She's a professional climber. She's 16 years old, almost 17, and we train all the time. But she trains 6 days a week. So right now, while we're on lockdown, we're just following the same schedule. We wake up every morning and begin work together.
Okay, can you just give us maybe a little tease of what your workout was today? And I promise we'll talk more about the coaching later, but just to
Sure.
get a sense of what you guys do.
So Indy wakes up before I do, and she does about an hour of mobility and yoga. A big part of her, not only her climbing but her overall fitness is flexibility and mobility. Um, so she spends time doing that on her own. She's quite advanced at it at this point in her career. And then when she's warm, I join her for this morning we were training fingers. So we were doing hangboarding for about an hour. And then I recently built her a climbing wall in our condo. So then we climbed for about an hour and a half, followed by another half hour stretching, and then she got to have lunch.
Yes, that climbing wall is very impressive, and
Yeah,
I'm gonna have more questions about that, maybe offline.
sure,
But okay, that's fantastic. And like I said, we will talk more about the coaching later. But
sure.
before we do that, why don't we talk about your history in climbing? And maybe if you can parallel that with some of the sort of general history of the sport,
Sure.
and I'll just give a little bit of preamble. The reason why I wanted to do this so bad was anybody who knows me knows that in the last almost 2 years, I just won't shut up about rock climbing. I discovered it on a whim. I went to visit my brother. We were trying to find a fun activity for our kids to do together when we went to visit. He said, "Hey, there's a rock climbing gym." I'm like, "I haven't been rock climbing in like 20 years." And then me and my daughter, we just like fell in love with the fun athleticism of it all, and
Do you
we've been
remember what gym you went to?
we went to a gym in near Kitchener. I don't know if it was exactly in Kitchener. It was a really nice facility. It had a huge bouldering area that you could climb on top of in the middle, and then there
Yeah.
was all these other uh, rope climbing along the sides. But I
Right.
mean, at the time I didn't know what I was looking at. Like I didn't understand any of the terminology or any of that. I was just climbing up, having a blast, and being exhausted.
That's right.
Uh, so anyway, with all that said, yeah, your history in climbing and maybe a little bit about what was going on in the climbing world in general.
Absolutely. Yeah, people. I get a lot of questions about climbing. Just in general, what is it? It is still a fringe sport, even though it's growing so quickly. I think compared to other sports, it's still a fringe sport. There's a lot of questions around it, which is exciting for me because I want to see the community grow. Um, I think honestly, climbing's been around forever. I don't see how our DNA has changed much. I think the earliest humans probably looked at a gorgeous tree or a big rock and wanted to climb it in the same way that we do today. So I would probably start by saying climbing's been around forever. But modern rock climbing, you know, uh, modern rock climbing, I guess, started in the uh, probably late 1800s, and then really with gear advancements in the early 1900s, it started to take off. So um, yeah, and I would also point out to listeners that there's a difference between mountaineering and uh, and rock climbing. So mountaineering is sort of like Everest. You're hiking up snow and ice, and you've got a lot of equipment and rock, and you're setting up camp. It's quite an expensive and unique thing. I've never done it. I've never done any mountaineering. But rock climbing is something very different. That's the sport of rock climbing, where you're climbing up a sheer rock face with climbing shoes and special chalk to dry your hands, and a rope and a harness and a partner. And so that's what I do. That's what my world is rock climbing, the sport of rock climbing, especially competition climbing indoors. So
Okay.
does that sound like a
Yeah, yeah, and so
intro?
yeah, yeah, absolutely. So when did you get started in rock climbing, and what was your first experiences with that? Because I mean, prior to this quarantine situation, it seemed like there were climbing gyms opening everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, I similar to you, Phil. I sort of stumbled upon it. I didn't really know rock climbing was a thing. I grew up with that uh, feverish desire to climb, so I was climbing trees and train bridges, scaring the crap out of my friends and my mom. Um, and then when I was 20 years old, I stumbled upon Joe Rockheads in Toronto, and that was my start, and I was as hooked as you, and it became all consuming for me. So I've been climbing now for 25 years, and at the time, yeah, rock climbing was booming in some parts of the world. Um, I only knew of Joe Rockheads at the time, but since then, climbing is huge in the city. I think we have, in terms of population, climb gyms per capita, we have one of the higher populations in the world. But I've seen it grow a lot since I started, and yeah, and I was hooked immediately. I started competition climbing right away. I started setting right away. I started coaching right away, and uh, and yeah, that was my journey into the sport.
I think my first time climbing was also at Joe Rockheads. I think it
Yeah.
was probably, I was maybe in elementary school. It was like a class trip or whatever. And
Wow.
for the longest time, that's all I remembered was Joe Rockheads. And then once I got into it and discovered all these other facilities, and so many facilities have opened up recently that
Oh yeah.
it's really impressive. Okay, so you talked a little bit about competition climbing and setting. Maybe you can talk a little bit about the different types of climbing disciplines that there are and how competition climbing differs from others.
Would we be talking just about indoors then, or outdoors?
Both. Let's as far as you'd like to explore.
Sure. Yeah. So there's yeah. So like I said, when it comes to outdoor climbing, if you want to start there, there's mountaineering, which is climbing up these giant mountains, and then there's the sport of rock climbing, and then outside rock climbing is split into two categories. Basically, there's route climbing, which is climbing with a rope and gear up, various heights. You can do some climbing in Ontario with a rope and a friend, and do some 50-meter, 70-meter routes, or you can go to Yosemite and climb big walls, where you're doing multiple pitches, and you're climbing 1,000 feet. It's again, that's something I've never done. I've always wanted to do big wall climbing, but that's a very different thing as well. Um, and then the other sport outdoors is bouldering, and bouldering is something I think I probably get the most questions about for people that are new to it. Bouldering is basically climbing on smaller rocks. Oftentimes, they're actually boulders, um, and they're not very high. Sometimes they're only 8 or 9 feet high. Some boulders are actually much higher, but bouldering is basically there's no equipment. You have a crash pad, which is basically a high density foam pad that you lie on the ground. They're not usually very big, and you climb over it on small boulders, maybe 3 to 10 move climbs, and usually bouldering is based on difficulty. So um, you're climbing up very small holds, tricky, difficult climbs. But to the new listener, that probably sounds either dangerous and or boring. But bouldering is usually the preferred for climbers. Bouldering is usually the preferred method. It's very freeing. You know, you kind of put a crash pad on your back, go out with some friends, and you can get a lot of climbing in a day. You know, just sort of scurrying about and trying all these boulder problems in one location. It's a lot of fun. Whereas route climbing does take a lot more work. You have to set up, all your gear and your draws and your rope, and one person climbs up and then back down, and then you switch. So you usually get less climbing in when you're doing a day at the rock with route climbing. Um, but yeah, that's the outdoor experience as far as I know. But I have lots of friends that travel and do really big wall climbing with gear, and you're camping out on the side of the wall 1,000 feet up. And I have other friends that do trad climbing, which is a completely different experience where you're placing gear so that um, if you fall, you basically are hoping the gear catches on the rock and you live. Um, yeah, there's
Jeez.
a lot. It's a whole world. I mean, it really is a whole world, and there's no way you could run out of things to do once you enter the climbing arena.
Okay, so that's the outdoor space, and
Yeah,
what's in the indoor space?
indoor space is where I live. So climbing, obviously, once it started to move indoors, which was a natural progression, just because it was becoming more popular and people needed to train anytime, anywhere, and not dependent on weather or location. So indoor climbing was a natural evolution, and then out of that space, competitions were put together very, very quickly. I think the first international world championships or world comp was in 1991. Um, and then it's grown quite a bit since then. So as soon as I started climbing, I was involved in competitions, and um, there's 3 types. Most people are familiar with speed climbing. Speed climbing is basically you're on a 15-meter wall that is just off vertical. I don't remember the exact degree. I think it's like 95 degrees or something, but it's just off vertical, and you are racing up it as fast as you can against an opponent. Um, Speed climbing is different also because it's a fixed route, meaning that the holds are the same and the wall angle is the same and the composition of the holds is the same. So no matter where you're training in speed, what country, what part of the world, it doesn't matter. It's the exact same route. So in that case, it's a little bit more like gymnastics in the sense that you're rehearsing movement and you're building, muscle memory to try and shave off milliseconds of your time. It's a phenomenal sport to watch, but it is quite different. Speed climbers are usually just speed climbers. They usually specialize in that. And
Ye-
then the other two, oh, sorry, go ahead.
no, I was just gonna touch on that point you made about it being a phenomenal sport to watch. I think of all the climbing disciplines, it lends itself most to spectator sport or television audience because it's exhilarating. The height of the wall is tremendous. The
Yeah,
athletes are flying up. It looks like they're galloping vertically, and
yeah.
then often it's heightened with this drama that the wall is actually above a pool of water, and there's
Oh,
no
that's different
rope.
too.
What?
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so what you've actually touched on is not traditional speed climbing. Traditional speed climbing is that sport that you're racing up the same route. Um,
Okay.
and it's been around for a while, and also like you said, it does lend itself to the spectator because you need not have any previous experience to understand it. You have a
Yes.
person on the right, you have a person on the left. Whoever gets to the top first wins. That's speed climbing. What you brought up over water was Basically, it started with well, at least Chris Sharma, a legendary climber, uh, made it popular, and it was called deep water soloing. And so basically, he was climbing these enormous walls over the ocean, over water. And so if he fell, he would fall into the water and have to swim to the edge of the rock and change his shoes and or his chalk bag or whatever he was going to do to let himself dry off a bit and then go again. And then what he did is he started a he basically turned that into a climbing competition where a wall was built over a giant, swimming pool, and then people would race up two identical routes, and if they fell, they would fall into the water. The competition now is called Seco Block, and it's wild. My daughter did it a couple years ago, and it was
Oh,
actually
really?
yeah, it was
Wow.
terrible.
I can imagine.
Yeah, I think it was 65 feet. And I don't know, not many people know the experience of falling 65 feet. It's You're falling pretty fast at the point you hit the water. So um, it's an amazing sport, but it's a bit terrifying. And watching my little girl climb up that thing was pretty hectic.
Okay. Okay. So you talked about the speed climbing, and then you made the clarification on what can you say the name of that discipline again? Over the water. What is it called?
Oh, so it's deep water soloing. So you're climbing without ropes. Soloing means you're climbing without ropes, and yeah, it's now a competition series called Seco Block, um, and I'm sure there's others. I know that I know Chris Sharma worked with Red Bull to do another one where they were climbing on a bridge, and um, but yeah, if you look up Seco Block, you're gonna find, and the latest one was in Montreal. Um, I don't know if that's the latest one actually, but the one we did was in Montreal over a giant pool of water. I have some really beautiful photos of it. Um, but yeah, it's pretty intense because if you land the wrong way, hitting that water doesn't feel like water. It feels a bit more like cement. And during the comp, I watched two athletes get carried out of the pool on a stretcher.
Oh my! Wow.
Yeah,
Jeez. And I
yeah,
mean, and at that point when you're falling, you're exhausted. It's not like it was a planned fall, right?
yeah.
It's
That's right. A landfall is something very different. Usually, when you're on a route and you have a rope and you've got some space beneath you, and you tell your belay partner, "I'm falling." You can take a big fall, but you have your feet in front of you so that when you slam back into the wall, you're prepared. Um, there's lots of different scenarios where you can fall with control. Um, but in this particular event, you're racing. So by definition, you are not making precise movements.
mm-hmm.
And usually when you fall, you're slipping. So it does create falls that, as you said, are not planned, and trying to right yourself in the air so you land properly, because there is a proper way to jump into the water from a high height, um,
Mm-hmm.
and usually that is not what's happening when you're falling off the wall in a sequel block competition. So uh, yeah, but still athletes line up to do these comps. I mean, they're sold out, so it's uh, it's certainly a lot of fun. I don't think I would do it. I'm too old. I would.
Okay. And so about maybe you can now talk about some of the other indoor climbing types.
So yeah, so all of that is to say that those are things that are happening. My world is route climbing indoors and bouldering indoors, which are the same as outdoors, except you're inside. Bouldering competitions are usually half of the season, the first half of the season. Um, I'm training my athletes for bouldering, which is again, if you look it up. It's just a very unique sport. It's come a long way too. Nowadays, if you look up bouldering, it is a bit bizarre to watch if you're new to the sport. It looks a little bit more like American Ninja Warrior. There's athletes jumping on the wall and doing all sorts of athletic and acrobatic movements. Um, and it's also some of the holds are so small. What you're holding on to is so small that you can't really see what they're holding on to, so it's really difficult to understand what they're doing. Um, but that's bouldering, and depending on how much you want to get into that, there's a very yeah, unique scoring system,
Yeah,
and
I'd like to. Yeah, I'd like to get into
yeah,
that.
so bouldering is based on difficulty. So when people say, "Oh, your daughter's a climber," so what is that? Based on speed? That's what everybody says, right? They know speed climbing as a sort of default understanding of climbing. So usually I explain that speed climbing is what we just discussed. It's very different, and bouldering is based on difficulty. So the holds are usually quite bad. And the reason for that is that bouldering is not like a route. So a route, let's just say a route in indoor climbing, a route could be, you know, it could be 50 or 60 feet, 70 feet of climbing. Um, so there's lots of different opportunities to fall. Um, Whereas in bouldering, you might only be climbing 12 feet. Um, so there's not very many moves to get from the bottom to the top. So each move, if you think of it like that, is uh, is incredibly difficult. It's hard to explain to non-climbers how hard these problems are and how hard you have to train to be able to hold on to the holds on the wall and maintain your body position and do some of these moves. It's incredibly sophisticated. And so basically, to explain the scoring system in a nutshell, you would start on a beginning hold or beginning holds, and then you might have two or three moves to what we would call a bonus hold, or a zone hold is what it's called now. And that's basically a hold somewhere in the middle that you would get accredited for. So if you're able to grab it and hold on to it, you would get accredited for that. And then you get to the top, the last hold, then you would get accredited as having a top. So it's basically ranked. So if you were athlete A and you topped two out of the four boulder problems, then your score is two tops. And if someone else scored one top, you would beat them. If you were both scored two tops, then climber A might have two tops and three zones, meaning for three of the boulders, they were able to get to that midway point, but not get a top. So their score would be two tops and three zones, whereas climber B might only have two tops and two zones. So
Hmm.
after you calculate tops, then you calculate zones, and that's how you determine your winners. Um, and typically, depending on the competition, but you're looking at, usually you have 4 minutes to climb the problem, which means you can fall, and then start again, and then fall, and then start again. So within that 4 minutes, you have as many tries as you want, but that's also a way they score it. So if you and I have the exact same score at the end of a bouldering session with tops and zones, then we look at how many attempts. So how many attempts did you take total to get your tops? And how many attempts did I take to get mine? So the ideal score is four tops in four attempts, which means you did all four problems on the first go. So that's
Okay.
probably a nightmare to understand without seeing it, an example, but that's how.
No, no, I think it was clear. You have a certain amount of time to reach the top stage of
Yeah,
a problem, and along the way, there's sort of like a median stage that you can get a half a point or partial credit for,
basically,
and
basically.
and and then yeah, okay. And what is the frequency of these competitions? Actually, before I get into that, there's one more. Type of indoor climbing that I wanted you to talk about, and that would be lead climbing.
Okay, so the second half of the season, so I said bouldering starts the first half of the season.
Okay.
Then the next half of the season, athletes have to get ready for lead climbing or route
Okay.
season. So lead climbing is essentially you have draws, what are called basically they're called draws. They're clips that go up a wall, and that's those are your safety clips. So what you would do is there would be a route set, hold set all the way to the top, and you would start with your rope attached to you, and then a belayer, somebody who is attached to the rope as well. The rope is fed through a belay device, usually called a gree, and your climber starts climbing up the wall. And as they get to each clip, which they're usually placed, a few feet apart or a couple meters apart, depending. they would then clip their rope into that clip. So when they would fall, they fall to the last clip that they clipped, and then the belayer would the gree would catch, the rope would go tight, and you would be safe, and that's basically how that works. So lead climbing is you're climbing up the wall and clipping in as you climb, clipping the rope in for safety, and then you only get one try. For route climbing, it's very different. It's a lot of stress. You get one shot at the route, and then the belayer lets you down. It's the next person's turn. Unfortunately, what that means is that I've seen climbers train, the entire year, 6 out, 3 hours a day, 6 days a week. They're training for a competition. Then they're saving thousands of dollars. They're usually fundraising or, uh, saving money to be able to travel to, I don't know, Russia for some sort of championships. And then they slip on the first move, and that's it.
Hmm.
That's the end of their try, and they go home. So that's
Uh,
route climbing. There's a lot more pressure, I
Now, is
think.
there a time component to that as well, or?
Yeah, and once and again, there's so many different types of comps, so I'm just referring to like professional climbing.
Yep.
Um, but yeah, so in a standard route, you have 6 minutes. So if you got to a really good hold and you decided to just rest, um, you could time out before you actually fall off the wall, which has happened many times.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay. And so these you mentioned these disciplines, and we talked about, there was only one place in Toronto that we knew about, Joe Rockheads. Now there's
yeah,
a bunch of places, and until this pandemic was the 2020 Olympic Games were going to take place,
yeah,
and climbing was going to be a part of that. So maybe you can talk about that a little bit.
yeah. This was a really big deal for our sport. Really exciting that climbing was elected to be in the Olympics in Tokyo 2020. Unfortunately, there's not much to tell because it's all guesswork from here. From what we've been told, it's postponed until 2021. But I'm not a big fan of trying to predict the future. So with COVID-19, it doesn't seem to be going anywhere in a hurry. And we don't know if that'll just be it after this. Anything can happen. So it's pretty exciting that we got that our sport is in the Olympics. It'd be a huge, huge boost to the industry in general, just in terms of exposure. But but yeah, it's at the moment nothing's happening. There are still many competitions, which are also, by the way, on hold right now. But we have what are called World Cups, which are huge professional international competitions, several of them per year. And then once a year, a World Championships. There'll be a host country. It's very much like the Olympics. Um, so that's ongoing. But right now, those are on hold, and the Olympics are on hold as well.
Okay, maybe you can just briefly talk about the format that the Olympics were going to have and sort of the kind of problems that uh, was for climbers.
So they were going to do for the first year they were going to do a combined. Were they going to do a combined event?
Yes, yeah, it was all three disciplines
It was all
and
three
one
disciplines
medal,
combined.
really.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So so the biggest trick since we've first heard that we were going to be in the Olympics. The biggest trick was for route climbers, lead climbers, and boulderers to learn how to speed climb because suddenly speed climbing was going to be, you know, um, in the Olympics and not segregated. It wasn't going to be its own thing. So in order to participate, you would have to be able to achieve a score in all three disciplines. Um, this has been in the climbing community. This was at first, definitely a point of contention, and some funny jokes about how unrelated speed climbing is to bouldering and lead climbing. Um, it is very different. It's a different mechanics, and yeah, and that definitely posed a lot of problems for a lot of climbers, especially for people like us. So my daughter and I, Indiana had to learn how to speed climb. She is not a speed climber at all. She's not a fast twitch athlete. Which means her muscles are not really designed that way naturally. They're not. fast firing muscles. They're sort of more slow and strong muscles. So to learn how to sprint essentially um, was very difficult. And also, we don't have a speed wall anywhere in Toronto. So we, at least not an official one. So we were at the time we were getting ready to learn speed. We were driving to Michigan to an amazing gym called Planet Rock almost every weekend. Um, so I would, we would Friday would come and we would I'd come home and get packed and Indy and I would say goodbye to her sister and mom, and we would take off for the weekend and live in the gym and just train speed climbing, and then have to drive home. It was a lot of work. It was definitely a lot of work, and I know a lot of athletes struggled with trying to figure out how to train an entirely new sport, really unrelated in almost every way.
Hmm. Yeah, and I don't know how accurate this is, but what I had been hearing was that the purpose of the combined competition was merely for this, uh, as it is a demonstration sport. And then if it was
Right.
to be adopted, they actually would split it up into the individual disciplines,
Exactly.
which sounds kind of crazy to have these athletes just prepare in this one window or potentially two windows. But whatever, there's a method to the madness, I suppose. Okay,
Yeah,
so
definitely. Yeah.
okay, so we've got this competition climbing. Now, one thing I want to talk about the competitive bouldering scene as a spectator sport. I now granted I've been exposed to climbing, but I was really enjoying watching some these bouldering competitions before I even got like deep into the climbing. Just when I started,
Yeah.
I find it is pretty good television. And one thing that I love about it too is that the female and the male competitors are placed side by side. They don't compete against each other, but it's the
Right.
same platform. It's the same, like, there's no status difference. In
Yeah.
fact, I'd argue the most, at least, I'm not super exposed, but the most exciting competitor is a woman right now. This young woman, Janja Gambert. I hope I
Yeah.
pronounced that.
Yanya Garbrandt. Her name's
Yeah.
Yanya Garbrandt. Yeah.
Okay. There. Thank you. And she's just exhilarating to watch. It's just amazing.
This is the amazing thing about climbing. I mean, there's lots of amazing things about climbing, but one of them is yeah, I suppose unlike many other sports, or at least in the traditional sense, it's a pretty even playing field. I could take a traditional route, a World Cup route, and um, and put the best guy and the best girl side by side, and take bets on who's going to win, and you'd be a fool to put all your money on the man.
Hmm.
It's pretty even. Yanya Garbrandt is on paper the best competition climber who's ever lived,
Oh
uh,
wow.
and it's not even close. I mean, she's the best competition climber by a mile. Um, so in terms of competition climbing, she is the best athlete in the world. Um, and then we have a guy named Adam Ondra who overall climbing, so outdoors and indoors. And all types of outdoor climbing, like we talked about earlier. He does the big wall stuff, bouldering, lead. Uh, he is unquestionably the best climber in the world. But it is very beautifully mixed and just as exciting to watch both men and women. And definitely, yeah, I find it funny actually because I do have two daughters, and my one daughter Indiana is a professional climber. She placed fourth at the Youth World Championships. Uh, she now is way out of my league. I mean, I'm a pretty strong climber, um, and I'm nowhere near her. I can't keep up with her anymore at all. But it's bizarre to see these sort of old mentalities of big dudes coming in, from the weightlifting world, and they see some little kid, some little girl, doing things on the wall that they just can't even understand, and they're scratching their heads like, how is this possible? So it is fun to see a sport that really shows off the phenomenal athleticism and actually just raw strength of of everybody who decides to train at it at the highest level.
Yes. And that strength and that fitness is the next thing that I want to talk about. And you mentioned American Ninja Warrior.
Yeah.
And I haven't, like, I know of that and I've seen clips, but I never watched that show. But I did watch Ultimate Beastmaster on
Okay.
Netflix,
Yeah. Yeah.
and which is the same thing, just a different production
Sure.
company. And lo and behold, top level athletes, Olympians. There was a gold medalist, Olympic swimmer,
Yeah.
CrossFit coaches in the finals, climbers, ice
Yep.
climbers. Like
Yeah.
the level of fitness, and this is like, I'm somebody who comes from a martial arts background.
Yeah.
I've been doing Brazilian Jiu Jitsu for over 12 years,
Me too. We
and
should talk about that next time.
oh my gosh. Okay. Okay. Well, yeah, we'll get back to that. But I always thought of MMA fighters as being sort of like the most elite athletes, not
Sure.
necessarily from pure physically, but certainly when you include the mental aspect of the sport.
Sure.
And I'm from the physical standpoint, I'm obviously I'm biased because of my passion for it, but
Yeah.
and I've seen it in my own physique. The athleticism required in rock climbing, it I feel it's second to none. So maybe you can talk about that.
Yeah, okay. So as a coach, I'm a big fan of sport, but not in the traditional sense, not in the traditional sense of you know rooting for my team to win, but in the sense that I spend unfortunately way too much of my time researching the top uh, coaches and trainers and psychologists and specialists in numerous sports throughout history across around the world. So I've done a lot of research and study and interaction with the distance swimming community, not just the competitive swimmers but distance swimmers. So these men and women, usually women, who have a phenomenal capacity for distance swimming, just doing insane things to their bodies and pushing themselves. So you could argue that the strongest minds could be distance swimmers in terms of just going through absolute agony for hours on end without any sense of stopping. Um, so I mean, there's amazing strengths in all sorts of things. Brazilian Jiu Jitsu, I'm a huge fan, and I actually use a lot of their training, their approaches to training with my climbing athletes. Um, but yeah, if you're talking about definitely like finger strength, I'd say that's when you start getting into climbing being a very unique sport. Kind of from the elbows to the tips of your fingers, you have you just have it's almost superhuman. You have a superhuman ability to hold on to things that no one in any other sport is even close. And I would say that with grip training in jiu-jitsu, that's a big part of it in Brazilian jiu-jitsu. You're doing a lot of grip training. And I remember when I started Brazilian jiu-jitsu as a climber, um, I was just able to literally in all my competitions and in all my and rolling with athletes in the gym, all of my submissions were by choke, and it was because as soon as I grabbed onto your gi, I didn't have to let go. I didn't get pumped, I didn't get tired. It was just so easy for me, but it's because I came from a background of climbing. So definitely, I'd say when it comes to strength within that part of your body, it is second to none. There's no sport like it.
I even found it. I find where I see the biggest difference is, yeah, you might have a very tiny hold that you're holding on with, like it looks like you're pinching this hold,
Yeah.
but really that pinch, it's your entire core
Oh yeah.
that is going through that. And,
Oh yeah.
that was the shocking thing to me. You mentioned that your daughter has this yoga routine. And now I don't have a lot of experience in yoga, but as I was doing more and more climbing, it really reminded me of yoga because of the poses, the mental
Absolutely.
concentration.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's yeah, it's hard to understand all that. Like to be a great climber, the amount of overall athleticism that you need and the amount of work that these athletes put into shaping their core and their legs and their flexibility and their mindset. Um, it is phenomenal, and it is absolutely full body tension, full body understanding, um, full body control. And it's very at the highest level, it's very scientific. It's very scientific in terms of the physiology and the mechanics, what we call the body mechanics, and how you move and how you control leverage and swing and all sorts of things. It's definitely not a shallow pool. You can go very deep with the sport and the understanding of the sport.
Okay, so you sort of talked about your coaching approach a little bit. Maybe you want to explore that a little bit more. Talk about your methodology, what you think a high level athlete requires.
Sure, yeah. So coaching for me is definitely a passion project. It's just something I really really enjoy. And my full time job, other than coaching, is I've been an educator with the school system for a very long time. And I would definitely say that my coaching philosophy and approach to coaching came out of my experience in the education system. And I say that meaning that um, so every day in the education system, I deal with a whole bunch of difficulties with how the system has been set up from the beginning. So I'm dealing with overfilled class sizes, for example, which gives me, which means I have a greatly reduced ability to connect with each student, which means I have a greatly reduced, ability to support their particular learning styles and needs. Um, that's just one of the cruxes that I face every day as an educator, and not to mention just the fact that I'm dealing with an old model of education that puts groups together and forces them to respond to a singular curriculum. Everybody has to do uh, this, and it doesn't matter how different you are. Now, since in the recent years, education has adopted a whole bunch of really new and exciting language about student success and accommodations and resources support. But in reality, these are sort of band-aids. These are surface changes opposed to systemic cultural change in the education system. I don't know if you ever saw that education system comic. It's really funny. It was circulating for a while, but it was of a it's this comic drawing of a dog and a what was it, like a seal and a goldfish and an elephant and a monkey, and they're standing in front of this educator who says, "Okay, your exam for today is climb that tree." This this is kind of like the education system that we're dealing with, right? It's just everybody's so different, and the whole system is a little bit broken. So out of that kind of ideology, I approached setting up my approach to coaching. And so for me, you know, I really spend all my time trying to connect with each athlete in a really meaningful way. Um, Partnering with their parents, I work with a lot of young athletes, so I partner with their parents right away so that I have a fuller perspective of how I can support them and and how I can invest in their lives. So it's language I use with parents is that that I do want to partner with you to help raise your kids, and it's more than just climbing. It's about health and wholeness and happiness and excelling at a sport that hopefully will teach them about their life and about hard work and about training and about not giving up, and so that's really my passion. And so for my athletes, I create programs based on what I'm learning from them, and the plan is never fixed. It's always evolving, and it's like an organism. The plan is always evolving based on their needs and goals and strengths and interests and new ideas that we get. Um, so that's really my something I'm passionate about is trying to um, imagine a new way to work with a group of kids that is not our current education system.
And so that it sounds like that philosophy is not just applied to rock climbing, right? That sounds like a philosophy you'd like to apply to the general your general teaching.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, this is the thing, right? As best I can, I try to
Yes,
connect
of
with
course.
each individual. Yeah. But I think that's the only way. I mean, I've been lucky, and I don't know if it's luck, but I've had a lot of success in my coaching in that my athletes in competitions do very well. If you're just looking at numbers, our team, sends very few athletes because I do cap the team. I want the team to be small in numbers so that everybody gets enough attention. So we send few athletes, but we end up, with 60% of our athletes in finals or, um, some big numbers like that. So we do really well. And I think that I
That
would attribute
doesn't sound like luck to me.
that. I would attribute that though to just a lot of attention spent on making sure that each athlete feels very supported and encouraged, um, and there's always tweaks, there's always changes you can make. And when it comes to just regular fitness, even in the fitness world, I'm not a big fan of plans of programs. Um, if I handed you a month-long program, if let's say you purchased a month-long program from me, what happens if you have a question? What happens if you get a little tweak? What happens if you saw this thing on Instagram and you're like, "Hey man, I'd like to incorporate that." Like I think they have to be living. The plans have to be evolving. They have to be um and as an athlete, you have to have a connection with your coach that transcends climbing. I mean, my kids text me when they're struggling with homework, and we just connect and I help them through it. So when they come to next practice the next day and they're a little bit burnt out, I'm not asking them to do those extra reps and really pushing them because I know that they were up late last night dealing with homework and they're a bit stressed out. And so I think to be a good coach, you have to have, you know, a deep understanding of who your athletes are and what they need and how you can best support them. I don't see another way to do it, even though there's lots of lots of coaching programs that do it very differently. It's just not how I see it.
Okay, so you've got these students at Boulder Park, and you've
Yeah,
already talked about it quite a bit. You've also coaching your daughter.
yeah,
So maybe talk about the experience of living with an athlete that you're coaching, and that person isn't just any athlete. That's your daughter. You already mentioned concerns about her safety at times. So
yeah.
maybe you can riff on that.
Um, I'd say the only difference between me coaching Indiana and my other athletes is just our ability to cultivate a lifestyle around her training and climbing. Her mom and I see very eye to eye on the way we want to support our kids. So Indy right now is passionate about climbing and she wants to be a professional. She wants to do this at this point in her life. She wants to do this, with you know full time. She doesn't want to do anything else. So as part of that, we pulled her out of school. We set her up online so she does all of her learning independently. She trains 6 hours a day, twice a day. We talk about climbing. We talk about diet. We talk about she has nutritionists. She has massage coaches. She has um, a team set up around her. So I think obviously that's the level I would like to train all my athletes at, to be completely holistically, dedicated to the process of becoming better at climbing. But Indy's in a unique situation where her family is incredibly supportive and our lives revolve a lot around her training. So, my other athletes, they go home to various situations and circumstances that I can't control. So I'd say that's the biggest difference there.
Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask. Have you been watching The Last Dance on Netflix?
The
The
last dance.
so it is a documentary chronicling Michael Jordan's
Oh, yes,
years with.
I need to. I've been
Yeah,
told.
yeah. Because forget any of that. It really is a portrait into the elite greatness of it
Yeah,
in athletics. And
yeah,
so, sort of just how you're talking about your approach to, you know, revolving, changing your lives to support your daughter's, desires to be great.
yeah,
It's that mentality. I think you'd
absolutely.
really appreciate that. Okay, so that's fantastic. So I would be remiss if I didn't ask you also about I only discovered this I think today. I was looking at an Instagram post of yours, and you have another daughter,
I
and
do.
she's also an athlete.
Okay, so so her name's Pika, and she is, yeah, she's 14 years old. She's turning 15, and she's an artist. She went the other way. So that's my background. Is I'm a professional artist, which is a strange mix of sports and art, but that's the story of my life. And so she went that route. She's done sports her whole life, but not at a competitive level. She's not indie. Indie is driven by my eldest, the professional climber. She has a bizarre fire inside to compete. She's actually quite unhappy if she's not competing, or at least training towards some goal. There's a deep drive in her that is not something I taught her. It's bizarre and it's fun to watch, and I find I'm almost a fan of just her bizarre drive to excel. Whereas my other daughter is more of a cuddle up on the couch and watch a movie and read dozens of books per year and draw and make art. And so that's who Pika is. But recently she has found that her favorite exercise is training MMA. So we work together 6 days a week, and she's quite good. So yeah, she's definitely learning to love athleticism, but she would definitely never do anything competitive with it. It's just for herself.
Okay, okay, all right. Because I mean, if you want to add another level of like terrifying, if you had another kid, they'd choose to be a race car driver.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. It would be like it's definitely eclectic household. But yeah, she's not competitive, so for her, this is more an issue of just staying fit and having fun, and she really likes the idea of learning self defense. So
Yes. All right. Well, that's fantastic, Matt. I encourage everybody to check out your Instagram. You're posting wonderful videos daily. You're also running some competitions. Maybe you want to talk about some of that stuff that you're doing.
yeah, that's pretty fun. If you're not necessarily into climbing, I to keep the community motivated, I started an online competition series that you don't really need climbing. It started off focusing on climbing, but now it's evolving really into fitness. It's a big passion of mine, as I work with youth and actually a lot of athletes in terms of just increasing fitness and wellness. So I started a series online. I post challenges on my Instagram. People do them. They're usually counting a certain number of reps within time, or doing something within a certain amount of time. It's usually about 1 minute. And then people send me their video submissions, and then I update the community with the qualifying round and who's doing well and who's beating who. And it's gone worldwide, which is really exciting. So I'm getting submissions from Argentina, and you know, a guy just from the Ukraine just won today's competition, and then there's a finals, and I'm getting sponsors, and there's prizes, and
Oh,
it's
that's
just
great.
yeah, it's super fun. It's just to keep the community motivated, and it gives me something to do.
Yeah, yeah. I think I mentioned this off air before we started, but from your Instagram feeds, it sounds like you're not just working at keeping your body strong, but keeping your mind strong in these tough times. And I think that's really fantastic and inspirational to people. And so thank you for that. And thank you very much for joining me today. Is there anything you'd like to leave the audience with?
I don't know, man. That was fun. I've never done a podcast before, so this was fun for me.
All right. Well, we'll be sure to do it again when we'll talk about MMA next time and our jujitsu experience. And hopefully, the world will be up and running, and there will be competitions, and we can both talk about how amazed we are by Yenya.
Awesome. Sounds good, Phil.
All right. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Cheers.
Thank you very much to Matt Chapman for joining me, and thank you for listening at home. We'll be back soon with another episode.